All right, welcome everyone to Growing and Harvesting Vegetables Year-Round. Let's make sure this works here. There we go. Okay, if you go to cmastergardeners.org, you will find a lot of handouts about vegetable gardening and about other topics also. You'll find not only handouts, but a lot of videos. The information was developed by the Clackamas County Master Gardeners, and the ones listed here have information that coincides with today's talk. Now, Oregon State University Extension also has a lot of publications about vegetable growing with all the information you're going to need to know. So if you're interested in growing year-round gardening, I would highly recommend that you look through these publications to find some more answers and more information than I have time to give you today. Now, the objectives for this class are to know how to grow vegetables over a longer period of time, to be able to match vegetable types and varieties to the season, to learn the types of season extenders and how to use them properly, and also to know where to go to find more information on year-round gardening. Now, here are some facts about vegetable gardening. Vegetables need full sun. That means 6 to 8 hours a day. Now, there are a few vegetables, like some of your leafy vegetables and a few of the root crops, that may be able to take a little bit more shade. But to get the best vegetables you can, full sun is the best way to go. 6 to 8 hours a day is considered full sun. Now, most vegetables need a pH of about 6 to 7.5. So if you take your pH soil test and you see that the garden that you're growing your vegetables in is somewhere between 6 and 7.5, you'll know that your vegetables have a really good chance of growing in that garden soil. Now, most of us here in the Pacific Northwest have a lot of clay soil. Some of us have really hard clay soil, and clay is good. Clay does a lot of good things. It helps retain water, sometimes too much, but it does help retain nutrients, which is good. But adding organic matter to the clay soil will really improve it will not only improve the soil, but it'll also help your vegetables grow. And it is found that for vegetable gardens, about 5% organic matter added. Now that could either be compost, leaf mulch, steer manure, anything that's organic that you can add into the soil. Try to place your garden near your water source. You don't want to be dragging hoses all the way down to your garden or carrying buckets of water. So try to place your garden near a water source and choose a high spot. This will help. You want to avoid the drainage problems you're going to get in a low spot. And you also want to avoid those cool air pockets. When cool air comes into your landscape, the areas that are lower, that's where the cool air is going to go. That's where it's going to sit. So try to put your garden on a little higher spot. Now, Oregon State University did research, and they found that a 10 by 10 foot garden will take about 40 minutes per week, and that includes the planting, the cultivation, and the watering. They also found that a 30 by 30 foot garden will feed a family of 4. So you can do the math. If a 10 by 10 takes about 40 minutes a week for you to work on it and keep it in good shape, then you can kind of figure out how much time you would be spending on a 30 by 30 foot garden. Now, spring sowing of your crops is when everybody gets really excited about gardening, but there are a few things that you need to know before you put in those spring crops. And the first one is the soil warm enough? Now, seeds germinate at different temperatures, different soil temperatures, and roots grow. Certain plants' roots grow at different temperatures too. So what you would need to do is you have to figure out what it is you're growing, and you need to find out what temperature those seeds are going to germinate. You can do this by using a soil thermometer, and you can find soil thermometers at most nurseries or farm stores. You can see what they look like in the picture. The other thing you need to do is you need to make sure that your soil is good enough to be workable. If it's too wet, you're going to ruin that soil by tilling it or using a spading fork and just, moving the soil around. You're going to ruin that soil if it's too wet. So you can do a soil test, and that is called the squeeze test. Grab a bunch of soil in your hand and squeeze it. If you open your hand and that just stays nice and stiff, you'll know that your soil is not ready to be worked yet. But if you can open your hand and push on it just a little bit with your finger and it falls apart, you'll know that now your soil is ready. In our area in the Pacific Northwest and the Willamette Valley, we usually plant our spring crops around March or April, but that will depend on the weather. It will also depend on your soil type and a few other, maybe if you have raised beds or don't have raised beds. Now, for our spring crops, you are going to be planting your cool season crops, and that is lettuce, spinach, peas, root crops, onions, and more things like that. You'll also need to figure out whether you're going to be growing them from seeds or whether you're going to have to buy or grow your own transplants. Put the seeds in as plants and not as seeds. Okay, there are a few things that you can do to have your soil ready for your early spring planting. And one of those is raised beds. For those of you that have raised beds, the soil dries out faster and warms up faster than those of us that are gardening on a flat surface. I have a friend who has raised bed. She was able to get her spring planting vegetables in the ground about 3 weeks sooner than I was, because I plant on the ground and my ground was just not ready to be worked yet. The other thing you can do is in the wintertime, you can cover that area, and that helps with something like black plastic or greenhouse plastic or row covers or even coffee sacks, if that's what you have. This will help keep out some of the rain. It will help warm up the soil a little bit, and it will also help when it rains really hard, your soil can get compacted. So having something covering that soil area will help keep out the compaction from the rain. You can also use season extenders. And if it turns out that your soil is dry enough and ready to plant, but all of a sudden we get some really cold air temperatures, having season extenders will really kind of give you a jump start on your spring garden. And I'll talk about season extenders a little bit more later. Now, the summer garden is when most of us do our gardening. And most of you are probably watching this because you already garden in the summertime and you just want to learn how to extend your harvest. But if you're a first-time gardener, I would really suggest that you start out with a small summer garden. That way, you'll be able to see how much more time and effort it will take. And then next year, you can either extend your summer garden or you can start gardening in other seasons of the year too. Now, our summer garden are our warm season crops. That would be like tomatoes, beans, peppers, corns, and other things like that. Usually in our area, they are planted around May. And once again, that's depending on the weather, whether you'll be able to get it in the first part of May, the end of May, or maybe not until June. You're also going to be putting some of those plants in as seeds and some of them in as transplanted crops. So your beans and your corns, they can go in just as the seeds. The tomatoes and peppers, they would have to be grown as a plant before you put them in the ground. If you tried to put tomatoes and peppers in the ground as seeds, they would never be able to grow to maturity here in where we live in the Pacific Northwest. And then some of them can either be put in as plants or as transplants, as seeds or as transplants. Zucchini, cucumbers, sometimes people put corn in as plants, but they also do well just putting in the seeds. Now, here are some things you need to remember during the summertime. One thing is try to save some space for successive plantings. Have you ever put in a little row of lettuce, say lettuce, and it was growing, you were eating it, then it got a little hot and it went to seed and you couldn't have it anymore, and that was the end of your lettuce. But if you save some space and plant lettuce or kale or some of your other crops every 2 weeks, then you can have a succession of harvesting. You won't be stopping at one, you'll be successively harvesting as time goes on. The other thing you need to do is think about your space in your vegetable garden. Now we're talking about, we're going to be planting a spring garden, a summer garden, and a fall and winter garden. Well, the fall crops, your fall and winter crops, are going to be planted in the middle of summer. And if you are using the same ground, the same garden area for your spring and summer crop that you are for your fall crops, you're going to need to have some space in there. If you fill it all in and you don't have any space, you won't be able to plant those fall crops. The other thing you need to do is you need to learn about crop families. When you're planting for your fall crops, it's a good idea to rotate your crops. And here's an example. Say you planted broccoli for the spring planting, and you cut the big head off, and then you get the little heads that come. But then later in the season, it kind of stops growing. But you want to put in your fall broccoli plants. It's a better idea not to put them in the same place that you had your spring broccoli, because there may be some soil diseases under there that specifically affect the broccoli or other plants in that family. So you want to be able to have space to move that broccoli to a different section of your garden. Okay, got that? All right. Now, planting the fall and winter garden begins in the summertime, like I told you. And vegetables for fall and winter are cool season crops. Our spring vegetables are cool season crops, and our fall and winter vegetables are cool season crops. And then you need to decide what you want to grow. If you wait until fall to decide what you're going to put in, it's too late. You have to have that figured out, because you're going to be putting those crops in the middle of summer. Then you also need to figure out the planting dates. And a lot of the publications that I showed you, and more that I will show you, have that information in them. You're going to look for suitable varieties, and you're going to plan your season extenders, and I will talk about those in just a little bit. All right, now the challenge to successful fall and winter crop is getting your plants in the ground at the correct time and getting those plants established. And that might be difficult because of our hot, dry summers. You may need to give those plants a little extra help. So you might need to start your seedlings indoors or in a greenhouse. A lot of nurseries, and it seems like the last several years they've been doing a better job of it, a lot of nurseries or farm stores may in the middle of summer start getting some plants that are specifically grown for your fall and winter planting. If not, you may need to start some of those at home, either indoors or in a greenhouse. Now remember, I said we are going to be planting these brand new little tiny tender plants in the middle of summer, and it can get hot. 90, 95, 100 degree weather with the sun beating down on them, they're not going to be very happy. So a good idea might be to take a shade cloth, some type of covering, and put it over, like you see in this picture in the middle of this screen, to give those plants a little bit of shade until they can get established a little bit better. Now, as far as watering goes, most of you probably either water with a soaker hose or you water with drip irrigation, which is a good way to go, saves water. But if those plants are a little too hot in the middle of summer, remember again, these are freshly planted or freshly growing plants, overhead watering will cool them down. So with a hose or a watering can, it'll help cool them down a little bit in the heat of summer. So those are just some ways to help you succeed in planting for your fall and winter crop. Now, there are two types of fall crops. And remember, again, I said these are cool season crops. There are quick growing crops, which we plant in the ground, and they'll come to maturity and we can harvest them fairly quickly. And that would be something like peas, radishes, greens, and spinach. And then there are overwintering crops, the ones that are going to take longer before they reach maturity, and the ones that we can harvest at other times during the fall, through fall and winter. And that could be like root vegetables, your brassica, your bunching onions, fava beans, and garlic. Now, you can find plant lists and plant dates in many different places. Oregon State University Extension has two really nice booklets with this information in it. One is called Fall and Winter Gardening, Vegetable Gardening in the Pacific Northwest, and the other one is a Growing Your Own publication. The other place you can find a lot of information is in seed catalogs, but I really would suggest that you use regional seed catalogs. For the Pacific Northwest, we want to, if you find the information in a seed catalog and it tells you these are the planting dates and these are the plants that should be planted for fall and winter gardening, you need to use ones that are from our area. And if you have a seed company that's from Maine or Indiana or Nebraska, and they tell you their planting dates, they might not coincide with our planting dates. But if any of you are watching this presentation and you are from a different area, then your local extension agent and your local seed companies will be a good resource for you. There are also a lot of gardening books out there for such as a Cool Season Gardener and Winter Harvest Gardening that you'll be able to find this information in also. Now, here is the information, the type of information that you will be finding in those publications. So this is just kind of an example, and it may be a little bit different, whichever publication you're looking at. The ideas might be a little bit different, but pretty close. So in mid-July, that's when you're going to be planting your late maturing crops, the crops that are going to take a long time to reach maturity and ready for harvest. And those would be some of the things like beets and Brussels sprouts, bush beans should not be in there, cabbage, cauliflower, carrots, some things like that. Then we have our mid-August plantings. These are our mid-season crops. These won't not take long, maybe about 60 days. And once again, that's going to depend on the weather. It's going to depend on your soil and your fertilizing practices, exactly how many days it's going to take these plants to go from planting to maturity and harvesting. Those would be things like your collards, your early cabbages, which are going to have to go in as transplants, early carrots, kohlrabies, which at this time of year need to go in as transplants. If you're planting your kohlrabies for spring, they can go in as seeds. Leeks, perennial herbs, Swiss chard, turnips, winter cauliflower, things like that. And then we have our early maturing crops, the ones that should be up and ready to harvest in probably about 30 days. And you can see the list there of some of those. And then in October is when you would plant your garlic and your fava beans. Garlic's going to take a long time, but it does not like to be planted in the heat of summer. October is a good time to plant those garlic cloves. Now, by looking through those publications I mentioned, that's where you will find different types of lists like this, okay? Now, harvesting your fall and winter vegetables. The vegetables that you plant in the middle of summer are going to be harvested at different times. So for an early fall harvest, before the frost comes, you're going to need to get those bush beans and those sugar pod peas. You're going to need to get them up and growing and harvested before the frost, because the frost is going to ruin them. Then we have other vegetables that you'll be harvesting, some of them in the fall, all the way through winter. And that would include your broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, carrots, radish, lettuces. You can read that list right there. Rutabagas, kohlrabies. Those you'll be able to harvest. Some of them in fall, some of them you'll be able to overwinter and harvest them as the season goes on. Then there are some that you are going to be harvesting in early spring. So they're going to be growing all through the fall, all through the winter, and you're not going to be harvesting those until early spring. And that would be something like Swiss chard, spinach, parsley, onions. And then in the summertime is when you're going to harvest your garlic. Now, you probably noticed that I have spinach down through harvesting fall through winter and not harvesting until early spring. Well, a lot of that, once again, will depend on your weather, and it will depend on your soil, and it will depend on the nutrients that those plants have. Excuse me, sorry about that. Once again, you'll find a lot of this information in OSU or WSU publications. And you will find in those publications, you will find the names of different varieties that are listed specifically for growing in the spring or for growing in the fall. So take broccoli, for example. It's recommended that for spring, early Pac-Man, early Emerald, Arcadia, those are good spring planted broccoli. But for fall, you have better luck if you plant something such as purple sprouting or Rudolph. Now, if we take kale as an example, for spring, you can plant about any variety you want to. They all grow really well for the spring. But for fall, they found that winter red, winter boar, Siberian are very good varieties, specifically designed and specifically bred to do well in fall and winter. And for winter carrots, Danner's half-long carrots seem to do very well through the winter time. Now, I have several master gardeners that grow vegetables year round for profit, and they have given me some tips. And that is one is that the curly leaf vegetables can tolerate the cold better than the smooth leaf vegetables. So say if you're going to plant your kale, you want the curly kale. You don't want the smooth leaf kale. They have also found that your dark colored vegetables absorb more heat than your light colored vegetables. Probably why the broccoli, the purple sprouting broccoli does so well, because it is so much darker. Oh, and there was something else I was going to tell you, and I can't remember what it was. Sorry about that. All right, season extenders. Using season extender techniques can prolong the harvest of tender crops into winter, and also overwinter otherwise non-hardy crops, and allow for early planting, and also allow for early planting in the spring. When used properly, season extenders can actually add a month on either end of the growing season. So you can get started a month earlier and you can be harvesting a month later. Now, plastic tunnels are low tunnels that are about waist high, with these waist high frames and hoops. They're either made from PVC or electrical conduit, and they're covered with greenhouse plastic. They're usually long enough. Usually they cover a row or two of your vegetables. There are also hard plastic ones available if that's the way you want to go. Now, for those of you who have planted a fall and winter crop, and you've used these plastic tunnels, you may have found that a lot of condensation happens, a lot of water is splashing and dripping off of it, and that just causes some disease problems. So if you found that you have that problem, you might want to purchase the dripless plastic. It is a little bit more expensive than regular greenhouse plastic, but it will save you a lot of problems with disease, and it will help control some of those diseases. Oh, I'm sorry. Floating row covers. Floating row covers are a finely spun fabric, and it allows air and water and light to come through it. The material can trap solar warmth and protect against frost damage too. Now, this fabric can be made into a tunnel, just like the plastic ones we talked about. You can put hoops and cover it over, or you can also just lay it on top of your plants. That's where it got the name floating row cover. You can lay it over the top of your plant, leave a little bit of room inside for the plants to grow, and then somehow make sure that the wind doesn't blow it away. Put down some rocks or some bricks or some wood or something so the wind doesn't blow those row covers off. And they have found that the air underneath a floating row cover can be anywhere from 5 to 8 degrees warmer than the outside air. And when we're talking our cold winter temperatures, 5 to 8 degrees can be a big, big help in keeping those vegetables nice and safe and healthy and ready to be harvested. Cold frames, they are small boxes that create kind of a greenhouse around your little plants. They're usually made of glass, sometimes greenhouse plastic, sometimes plexiglass. These work for getting These work for not only getting your plants in the ground and in your garden earlier in the spring, but they also work for helping your tender plants with some winter protection. Now, there are two types of season extenders. Some have a bottom on them, and those types are usually used for propagating your plants. Some people will even put propagation mats to keep the plants warm. Season extenders also, cold frames also have lift up. They have a lid, so they lift up and down so that if it gets really, really hot, you can lift them up so they have more air circulation and it doesn't burn your little plants. The other type of cold frame is the ones that do not have a bottom on them. And those are the ones that you would set directly onto your garden, directly over the plants that you have in your garden. Now, if you are overwintering your root crops, you probably won't need to use a season extender. You can just cover them with leaves or straw, and then as the season goes on, you can just go over there, remove a little bit of that, and pull it out of the ground, pull your carrots out of the ground, and have them ready to eat. Fresh vegetables in the middle of winter, can't get any better than that. Now, you want to know, why should I garden year-round? Well, you garden in the summertime because that's the only time that you can grow your warm season crops. Your tomatoes, your cucumbers, your corn. Those are the ones we love to have. So that's why you grow them in the summertime. That's why you garden in the summertime. In fall and winter, the nice thing about fall and winter gardening is there are less chores. The weeds don't seem to take over like they do in the summer, and there's a lot less watering because we already have rain coming in. Also, it seems that the pests and diseases are not as prevalent in the fall and winter as they are in spring and summer, except with the exception of slugs and snails. You really do have to keep an eye on those, especially if you're using a row cover or you're using some kind of cover over your plants. Make sure you check them often for the snails and slugs. Also, you want to garden in winter because it's a good reason to get outside. It keeps you out there instead of being in the house all winter long. And in springtime is a good time to plant because then you're getting your garden ready and you'll be able to get those plants in earlier at an earlier time. Now, I know I may have gone through this rather quickly. There's so much information out there about growing fall and winter gardens, and I really couldn't tell you everything specifically. So the publications from Oregon State University and the ones from our 10-minute university at seamastergardeners.org will give you a lot more information. So now I'm hoping some of you have some questions and I'm able to answer, and my co-host Priscilla will be here to help us out. Hi, Priscilla.
Hi, Jane. That was really wonderful to hear about how we can garden year-round up here in Oregon. There was one question earlier about garlic and whether during the rain that garlic needs to be covered.
No, most people do not cover their garlic during it grows really well. So no need to cover it.
All right. We're still waiting for some questions to come in. Let's see.
Maybe I answered them all.
I think you really had a very comprehensive presentation, and the links that were being put into chat, some people were trying to follow them or cut and paste them. There were a few difficulties, but I think we've solved that. And all of those links are actually in the presentation also, right?
Yes, they were. So they can watch it when it comes back. When they go to seamastergardeners.org in another week or so, they can watch the presentation and they will see the links there.
Okay, the questions are starting to come in now. So be sure to get those into the Q&A box. Here comes one. And it is, I just bought a greenhouse and I'm not sure how to use it. Can you go over the process of how to use a greenhouse? And there's lots of different models, but just give us a quick 101 on greenhouses, please.
Okay, so you bought a greenhouse. Well, of course, that's usually made to start your vegetables. So depending on what you're growing, January, February, March, you're going to be using your greenhouse to start to propagate your new plants, whether you're tomatoes, peppers, whatever those are. In the summertime, most people don't seem to be using their greenhouses because it is so hot already. But it is a good place if you're planning a fall and winter garden. Using your greenhouse to start those crops is a good idea. And then a lot of people also, not necessarily talking about vegetables, but a lot of people will take cuttings of flowers like geraniums, or I start a lot of my cuttings in September and April so that I have a lot of flowers come spring to put out in my landscape. A lot of people will start propagating other hardwood cuttings of maybe vegetable, not just vegetables, but what am I thinking of? Berry crops or herbs and things like that. So you could actually use your greenhouse all season long. And there's a lot of books out there about greenhouse gardening, and Oregon State University also has some publications on greenhouse gardening. So good
Okay.
luck with that. You'll have fun.
And what's the optimum temperature for that greenhouse to stay at?
You know, it depends on what you're growing. One thing that is best when you are using a greenhouse is to have heated propagation mats to keep your roots and the vegetables or whatever you're growing warm, but have the air temperature a little bit cooler, because that will help with disease problems if the air is cooler and the soil is warmer. But it will all depend on what you're growing.
Is there any temperature that's too hot?
Well, in the middle of summer, when it gets to be 100, it's definitely too hot. A lot of people will be able to put shade cloths. Maybe if your greenhouse is small enough, you can put a shade cloth over the top of it to cool it down.
Okay. Next question is, how do you know when it's getting too late to harvest your root vegetables?
Probably the way they look. And sometimes if root vegetables get too old, you can tell that they don't look so well. And of course, if you tried to eat them, cook them, they would taste pretty woody. But it mainly would be the look of them. If they still look healthy and look like they are edible, then they should be edible.
Okay. So Paul is originally from the UK, and he has a comment. He goes, we usually have early, second early, and main crop potatoes. Is there something equivalent or here in Oregon?
We do have some varieties of potatoes. When you go to a nursery or a farm store to buy your seed potatoes, they will say whether they are how long until harvest. There are some early ones. Mostly they're just kind of early and late varieties here, but we do have some that will grow faster. We have a lot of little red potatoes that you can harvest when they're smaller, and then others like our russets or our Yukon Golds, which can have a longer season and be harvested later.
Okay. I've heard the term wintering over, and what are the advantages of, say, wintering over carrots or rutabagas in the season?
Sorry, I messed up here. Could you say that again? I'm sorry, my computer did a strange thing.
Oh, no, that's okay. So sometimes we get carrots and rutabagas growing, and they're up in the fall, but then you winter them over. What is the advantage of wintering over some of your vegetables?
You mean as in they're going to, oh, I see.
So they're not going to seed, they're just staying in the ground.
Well, then you're extending your harvest. That's the idea of fall and winter gardening, is you're extending your harvest, and you're going to be able to have those vegetables for a longer period of time.
Okay, how do you encourage pea and tomato pollinators into the garden? I guess this isn't really a winter question, but it's one that everyone's thinking about.
Yeah, putting other things that attract the pollinators in with your garden, the different types of flowers, the different types of letting some of these things go to seed. A lot of people will plant cilantro and then let it go to seed because the pollinators love the seed heads. They love those seed heads.
Right. And as a gardener, sometimes when my kale starts to go to flower, I will then just leave one or two of those plants flowering, and it really does pull in those pollinators, and they feel like they're getting a good deal there.
Yeah, I know. And I forget to cut all my broccoli. The little heads of broccoli that come up, they go to seed, and pollinators love those too.
And let's not forget, those flowers are delicious in our salads, and you can eat those flowers. So if it goes to flower, it's not all for one. So let's see, those all the questions that I see coming in. So any other last words of wisdom about winter gardening? Your presentation's been great, and if people have questions, feel free to go back and see it. It's being recorded and you'll be able to access it in a day or so. But how about some last words of wisdom, and I'll see if any questions come in when you're doing that.
Well, for one thing, if you're a brand new gardener, I definitely recommend that you start small and then over the years add to your garden. Unfortunately, people who seem to start with a very large garden and don't have enough time to take care of it get very frustrated, and then it's not something they think they're going to enjoy. So start small so that you can enjoy that garden that you will really enjoy year after year, and then you can add to it when you see you have more time or have learned how to take care of it. But if anybody has any other questions, they can always go to metromastergardeners.org and fill out a form, and the Master Gardeners are there to answer the questions. So thank you.
Yeah, and then the last little word of wisdom I have for early garden or new gardeners is you really think about what you like to eat, what your family likes to eat. Yeah. Plant those, because that's going to be really reinforcing. And then maybe branch out with one or two new varieties or a new vegetable, and see how it develops and grows in your garden.
Exactly. Great advice. Thank you, Priscilla.
Thank you, Jane.